With the new Rick and Morty episode out, I wanted to make an updated timeline video, with us now having the origins of Evil Morty in particular. The biggest revelation we got on Evil Morty was his origin story, which was wildly different than what a lot of people assumed. Evil Morty is seen as a sort of cosmic outcome to a lot of fans, and many people imagine him to not just be some regular Morty, but perhaps even a time-traveling Morty, perhaps even our own Morty traveling back in time to get his revenge on the Ricks, and to ultimately escape them from the finite curve. However, this doesn't seem to actually be the case with Evil Morty, but instead, his real origins may reveal how our Morty is becoming dangerously close to turning into Evil Morty himself. This latest episode showed that Evil Morty's origins are really much more simple than fan theories have made it out to be. Evil Morty was just like any other Morty, forced to go on adventures with his Rick, where he is purposely given the dirty and dangerous jobs so that Rick can get whatever crazy item he is after that week. Morty gets upset about what he was forced to do, something he knows Rick knows he shouldn't have to do, and Rick immediately explodes and makes it out like Morty is trying to pick a fight instead of get comfort and assurance that this doesn't have to keep happening. All Rick does here is tell Morty that he is going to keep going through with this because he's not actually going to quit. This Rick calls this Morty out on not quitting, and this Morty finally just gives up. He gets his Rick drunk and puts the finishing touches on some new technology that would turn his Rick into a cyborg servant. It's really tragic seeing him get his Rick drunk first, bringing him to the exact state that our Rick was seen in the very first episode, stumbling into Morty's room all drunk and talking about how important he is and how important their bond is. This is a moment that Evil Morty is very familiar with, and he knew that he could take advantage of Rick in this state. This is the moment he becomes that Evil Morty. Now, it would be easy to assume that Evil Morty was always the Morty to this Rick, but the very next scene shows Evil Morty going to a Morty agency, a place where Mortys who were abandoned or lost their Ricks can be paired up with new Ricks. It seems there wasn't much of a time gap between this, and Evil Morty already knew not just about this place, but about the effects of Mortys protecting Ricks from detection by balancing out their brainwaves, and also seemed to know about the central finite curve, the barrier surrounding it, and had plans to destroy it. This would mean that Evil Morty was probably already the sidekick to at least one other Rick, with the implication to me being that he's probably among the most experienced of the many Mortys. We may one day learn that this is something of a prime Morty, some sort of first Morty to meet not just a Rick, but to experience the multiverse. He may just be the furthest Morty along in the development as far as Mortys interacting with Ricks in the multiverse goes, and at the very least, our Morty may follow in his footsteps. Our Morty is the prime Morty in that he's the grandson of Rick Prime, but Evil Morty is like Prime Rick in that he's the first to go out and experience not just the multiverse and other Ricks, but the grandness of being the first of the kind to do this. Our Morty instead has been shaped by our Rick, who has spent his entire life trying to get revenge on Rick Prime, and because of that has experienced a scale of adventure that the other Mortys never seem to, especially with how expendable they tend to be. And there is even more evidence that this is where our Morty is going throughout the show. After roboticizing his Rick, Evil Morty used the Morty Agency to get a mountain of Mortys to avoid detection, and began kidnapping various Ricks by bringing them to this prison where they couldn't be tracked. Here, he could scan multiple Rick brains. At first, Evil Morty made it out like he was just trying to collect all the information on the various Ricks, but it became clear in later seasons that Evil Morty was trying to get as much information as he could on the nature of the central finite curve so that he can find a way to get out of it. He manages to lure our Rick and Morty into a trap by setting Rick up for his various crimes, but in the end, our Morty manages to rescue Rick before his brain can be fully scanned. For a while, Evil Morty manages to hide among the many Mortys that he had taken prisoner, being taken to the citadel of Ricks with him. And from here, he managed to work his way into politics by becoming the first Morty to run for office, after surviving an earlier attempt by our Rick to destroy the citadel. While he did manage to destroy its base of operations, the Ricks did survive as a whole and create a new, less functional citadel. After becoming president, Evil Morty had access to the Citadel of Ricks, which we would learn was designed by our Rick. In his mission to kill Rick Prime, he ended up going to war with the Ricks, proving himself to be a step above the rest along the way. In an attempt to appease our Rick, they would give him the location of Prime Rick's dimension, but in return, they wanted him to help develop a technology that would protect the Ricks throughout the multiverse from the Galactic Federation. When Rick and Morty made up after Rick left Morty for some crows, they returned to the Citadel of Rick's, where evil Morty, as president, was able to scan the last of Rick's brain over appetizers. This gave evil Morty the last piece of the puzzle he needed for his plan. Evil's Morty goal at this point wasn't to rule the Ricks or to simply destroy them, at least not entirely, but rather evil Morty wanted to escape the finite curve in which they existed. The finite curve is just a term used to refer to a spread of dimensions where a Rick appears to be the most intelligent being, protecting them from other realities where interdimensional travelers cannot just knock them off their throne, but perhaps cause mayhem in their dimension as a whole. As we saw in the latest episode, this seems to be the case outside of the central finite curve, where various beings have developed interdimensional travel, and it's a bit of a mess. Evil Morty can't feel safe as long as he is trapped in the central finite curve with the Ricks, and he knows that if he can get outside of that in any way, even by destroying the finite curve entirely, that the other Ricks wouldn't have any reason to venture out after him into dimensions where they might not be the smartest man alive. The Citadel seemed to be an important part of establishing the barrier around the central finite curve, though the destruction done to it by Rick didn't seem to affect that. Instead, destroying the curve is something that has to be done manually by the machine again, taking great power to undo the barrier that's been put up, or even to just crack through it. The information on how to do this is something evil Morty could only find in Rick's brain, perhaps as a sort of exploit only he knew in his head in case he ever needed to undo it. This allowed evil Morty to create a huge break in the finite curve, so he could finally escape, destroying the Citadel and killing a lot of key Ricks along the way, though it's been indicated that all these Citadels could also continue to break into alternate versions of themselves in alternate realities, with one Rick claiming during the election that they thought their Citadel was the greatest of them all in the finite curve. After escaping, the life of evil Morty seemed peaceful at first, and the rift itself was later fixed by some dinosaurs. But when Rick began playing with the dimensions in an attempt to find Rick Prime, the effects managed to reach all the way out to evil Morty with its waves of disruption. Evil Morty thus brings himself back to our Rick in an attempt to fix the issue as soon as possible so that he can return to his peaceful life, hoping that Rick will never find a way to indirectly bother him again, and that he might even consider that he owes Morty that favor. However, things escalate when they are pulled into Rick Prime's Hunger Game prison and decide to team up. What evil Morty now wants is a special machine that can erase the different versions of a person in every reality, with this apparently being what caused every single Diane to be dead at this point. This is likely why the Ricks of the Citadel were so willing to turn on Rick Prime, as they all ended up losing their Dianes from this as well. Evil Morty doesn't just want this machine destroyed so it can't be used on him, but he wants the schematics of it so that he can use it as a threat against all the Ricks, but particularly our Rick. He can use the design to pull in any random Rick he wants from across the curve, and then boom, they're all dead. With Prime Rick being defeated, this leaves the only plot left to explore being evil Morty's. And this machine is not actually being used as a reason to keep the stories apart, but a reason to eventually bring them back together. Of course, anytime that evil Morty appears, we get a little more nuance on our Morty and his relationship to Rick and the rest of the multiverse. It starts with our Morty thinking he's the most Morty of them all because he is under the one who is the most Rick of them all. Our Rick representing everything that evil Morty hates about the Mortys of the multiverse. Ultimately, that means our Morty will experience everything that any Morty could ever possibly experience with just his Rick, going on more adventures than any of them, adventures that always take you to the depths of your existence. Already, we have started to see how our Morty reaches his breaking point with Rick, always wanting to make up eventually, but reaching a point where he can't just play along with what is happening and act like he is okay, because he is not. At one point, our Morty is going to want to get away from Rick, and there is no way to do all that in the central finite curve. At some point, all our Morty will want is to escape it all, and the only way to do that would to become evil Morty, to find a place outside of the central finite curve. As evil Morty told our Morty when he first escaped, not wanting to put up with Rick, being sick of Rick, is what makes him the evil Morty. Wanting to quit simply makes him evil. Right now, the show is a shadow of what it used to be in many ways, with people criticizing the changes over the now long run of the show, and particularly the new voice cast this year, and a lot of fans simply want to quit the show but feel drawn back to it because of the little plot threads like this. The show's characters have always been about the relationship between the show and the audience, with Rick being the show and Morty being the audience. Evil Morty started as a symbol for people who loved the event episodes that he himself premiered in, with his return often mocking the audience for enjoying this aspect of the show when all Rick claims to want is fun, episodic, self-contained adventures. But at this point, Rick has become the villain of the series in many ways, to many of the characters, with everyone finding their happiness by putting Rick in his place and pursuing what makes them feel right. Morty becoming evil Morty, becoming someone who puts up with the episodic adventures less and less, is like the audience who may not be reacting to a change in quality per se, but a change in their own taste and the taste of the creators as both naturally diverge from where they originally found common ground. The tension here is that our audience could just quit and stop watching, but many choose to stay, watch, complain, and not discuss the layers of its changes, but to attack the show in many ways. The two are still drawn to each other, Rick and Morty, for one reason or another, but eventually an end will come, because whether it's the show itself that has to end or the audience as a whole that begins to tune out, at some point it's okay to just become tired and to quit.